our previous lesson, we were introduced to the various empires that were founded between 700 and 1750 CE. In that lesson, we got to understand how human societies, how human communities are subject to changes. In this lesson, we will be focusing on a very particular aspect of human existence, that is religion. And here, we will try to trace how religions, much like the societies they were rooted to, also underwent changes over the time period of 1,000 years that constitutes the focus of our discussion. So, let us begin this lesson. As an institution, religion is rooted in community feelings. Religion is something that is deeply personal, but it does not exist exclusive of the community aspects of religion. What do I mean by this? Now suppose within the Hindu religion itself, so many people worship different gods. That is to say, their faith, the devotion they show to their gods is very personal. That exists at a personal level. But at the same time, this personal faith is also bound by the larger forces of community feelings of the religion. Because there are certain festivals and rituals within Hinduism, or for that matter any religion, that binds all the people together. So, what we can understand from this is that religion can be deeply personal, but it does not exist irrespective of the collective aspect of religion. Now religion, like the societies they are rooted to, also undergo changes. In this lesson, we will try to focus on the various changes that different religions in the Indian subcontinent underwent over those 1,000 years. Now, what we have been talking about all this while is that communities change, they evolve. And now with the evolution of communities, the religions do not stay static. Now no religion is static. Religions are also dynamic in nature. The religions that we find in today's India, be that Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, or different other religions, these have not been the same thousands of years ago. These religions, as we feel and experience today, have undergone series of changes and processes of evolution. Now, when we talk about the relationship that religion shares with the communities, we have to factor in a very important aspect. Religions are shaped by and they give shape to the communities. What does this mean? While on the one hand, a religion of any given community shapes the codes of morality of the community itself, in turn, the socio-cultural ethos of that community also shapes the religion that is rooted to it. So, we cannot understand religion irrespective of or independent of the communities they are rooted to. In our previous lesson, we talked about the evolution of empires and communities, and so in this lesson, our focus will be on the evolution of old and new religions in the Indian subcontinent. Now, when we try to trace the history of religions in the Indian subcontinent, we have to keep in mind that in ancient times, Hinduism was the predominant religion in the subcontinent. Which is why earlier on people used to follow the rituals and practices that were laid down in the Vedas and the Upanishads. Now from this ritualistic practice of religion that was laid down in the Vedas and the Upanishads, people now evolved to following newer religions. From this, we have to understand that by the 7th century, different communities now had their own gods. So previously they were following everything that was laid down in the Vedas and the Upanishads. But as we talked about all this while, that communities were evolving, and with the evolution of the communities, these communities were having their own principal deities. So you can understand from this that previously Hinduism was dominated by the ritualistic practices that are laid down in the Vedas and the Upanishads, and here from the 7th century separate sects within Hinduism itself began emerging, and with the emergence of these new sects came into being the worship of new deities. Now, when we talk about the ritualistic practices of religion from the point of view of Hinduism, mention must be made of the Brahmanas. Now, the Brahmanas were learned men, they were scholars, they were priests, and it were the Brahmanas who presided over the ritualistic practices of religion around the 7th century. And when they presided over the ritualistic practices of religion, their importance, their power, their authority in the society also increased simultaneously. Now, you will be surprised to know that these Brahmanas, who were learned men, who were scholars, also introduced superstitions in the society. So these were people who presided over the ritualistic practices, and at the same time they encouraged superstitions in the society. One such superstition would be that the Brahmanas forbid the consumption of meat on particular days of the week. So there were many such superstitions that were encouraged by the Brahmanas. At the outset of this lesson, we talked about how this lesson will be devoted to tracing the changes that religions in the Indian subcontinent underwent over this period of 1000 years, that is from 700 CE to 1750 CE. Now, here we learned that the Brahmanas were gaining importance. The Brahmanas presided over the ritualistic practices of religion. Now, what we are talking about here pertains to Hinduism. Now, when we talk about the growth or the evolution of Hinduism into what we feel and experience in today's world, mention must be made of certain things. Those certain things would include the worship of new deities. Now, we already learnt about the worship of new deities that emerged around the 7th century. Because around the 7th century, many communities were emerging and evolving. And with the evolution of these communities, they had their principal deities. And these principal deities were the gods and goddesses that people belonging to those particular communities offered worship and devotion to. So this is one of the major changes in the evolution of Hinduism that could be traced to the 7th century. Along with that, we have to take into account the construction of temples. Now, the construction of temples is a point that we have to understand in great detail. Now, temples are the sites of worship or the places of worship of the Hindus. Now, without having temples, where would the Hindus worship? In order to practice religion institutionally, temples are required, and this is not just for Hindus. People belonging to other religions as well required their sites of worship in order to offer devotion to their gods. And so the construction of temples around this time played a major role in giving religion impetus, in giving Hinduism a new shape. Now, who were constructing these new temples? New rulers who were coming to power were constructing the temples. Now, in this regard, we can take into account an example of the Chola rulers. The Chola Empire ruled the southern part of the Indian subcontinent in ancient times. And the Chola rulers were all Shaivites. That is to mean the Chola rulers were worshippers of Lord Shiva. Now, when various Chola rulers came to power, they constructed many temples that were devoted to Lord Shiva. So, the construction of temples made religion, the practices of religion, more accessible to the people. Because the people of the communities could now go to these temples to offer their devotion and prayers to the gods. Now, while we talk about Hinduism and the evolution of Hinduism, we cannot understand this exclusive of the influence of the Brahmanas. Now, who were the Brahmanas? The Brahmanas were at the apex of the caste hierarchy. Scholars, priests, learned men constituted the Brahmanas. Just a while ago, we talked about how the ritualistic practices of religion, Hinduism to be specific, were presided over by the Brahmanas. Now, these Brahmanas were learned men, as we just discussed, which is why they could read Sanskrit. Now, the ancient religious texts of Hinduism, be that the Vedas, the Upanishads, or the famous epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, are all written in Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is a language that was not understood or read by the common masses. So, from this, you can understand how the knowledge of these Sanskrit texts was limited or restricted to these Brahmanas alone. And by the virtue of their knowledge of the Sanskrit texts, the Brahmanas now earned respect. They now gained importance in the society. The common masses, or the people who belonged to other castes that were lower than the Brahmanas, looked up to the Brahmanas. These were learned men. These were men who could read the Sanskrit texts. Now, the importance and the authority of the Brahmanas within the Hindu society further increased because they started getting patronage. That is to say, these Brahmanas were extended patronage by their rich patrons. Now, who were these patrons? These patrons were new rulers who were hungry for fame and social recognition. Now, allow me to give you an example in this regard. We know the Rajputs as a fearsome clan of rulers. They were very powerful warriors. But do you know that the Rajputs did not belong to the ruling caste or the Kshatriya? They were initially tribals. They belonged outside the caste societies. And in the process of gaining power, in the process of becoming rulers and warriors, these Rajputs assumed the position of Kshatriyas. So from being outside the society, these people entered the mainstream caste-based society and assumed the position of Kshatriya. Now, when a person from outside suddenly makes his foray into a big space, that person will be hungry for social recognition. Now, something similar also happened to the Rajputs and other rulers who did not belong to the ruling caste initially. These rulers, in order to gain recognition, in order to gain fame and popularity among the masses, they extended patronage to the Brahmanas. So, these Brahmanas who were already at the apex of the caste hierarchy, who were already very important and powerful men, gave support, gave recognition to these rulers. And in turn, this royal patronage that the Brahmanas got from these new rulers also increased and further enhanced their power and position in the societies. So from this, we can understand the hereditary position that were gained by the Brahmanas. Now, while we talk about the power gained by the Brahmanas, we have to take into account the fact that the Brahmanas were not just at the top of the caste hierarchy. They were at the top or the pinnacle of the society itself. We learned that they presided over the ritualistic practices. Now, they laid down a whole host of rules and rituals and practices that people from other castes were supposed to abide by. Now, this led to an unequal distribution of power in the society in the sense that the Brahmanas were dominating people of the other castes. Now, they were not just dominating religion, but they were dominating the societies at large. Now, people who belonged to the other castes found this Brahminical dominance and supremacy very, very oppressive, which is why people were now going against the grain. they were going against the flow, as this illustration shows you. Now, as a response to the oppression and the discriminatory practices that were instituted by the Brahmanas, new ways of thinking and questioning the religious practices now came into being. Now, people started posing many questions. Is it really that important to follow all the ritualistic practices in order to offer devotion to God? People realized that religion should be inclusive and it should not be discriminatory in nature. Now, these alternate ways of thinking introduced people to the thought of personal salvation. People realized that elaborate ritualistic practices that could be performed only by the Brahmanas were not required to actually offer devotion to God. Prayers and devotion to God can be offered at a very personal level, and it is one's devotion or bhakti for their God that can bring them salvation. This now brings us to the birth of the concept of bhakti. Now, what does bhakti mean? Literally, bhakti means devotion. It means devotion to a personal deity. Bhakti means that one can offer devotion and prayer and worship to a personal deity without the aid of priests and elaborate rituals. People no longer required to actually follow everything that was laid down in the Upanishads and the Vedas in order to offer their devotion to God. Because devotion to God can be offered at a very personal level. Through my faith, through my devotion, I can worship God, and this can happen independent of the priests and the elaborate sets of rituals. This now brings us to a discussion on the Bhakti movement. So, the Bhakti movement simplified religion, so to speak. It no longer believed that elaborate rituals or everything that was initially laid down by the priests were required in order to pray or worship God. Now, the Bhakti movement originated in South India between the 7th and 8th centuries. Now, since this Bhakti movement simplified religion, it gained widespread importance. It gained mass recognition. And so, this Bhakti movement now spread to different parts of the subcontinent from Tamil Nadu through Karnataka. So, let us find out which are those places to which Bhakti movement spread. By the 15th century, Bhaktism gained wide acceptance and recognition in places like Assam, Bengal, and different parts of northern India. So, the Bhakti movement that came into being as an opposition to Brahminical hegemony or Brahminical dominance now gained acceptance and recognitions in different parts of the subcontinent. Now, I am sure that whenever you hear of Bhakti movement, the most prominent name that comes to your mind is that of Mirabai. Well, Mirabai was known for her songs of devotion to Lord Krishna. And she was also known for forsaking traditional women's roles and devoting her entire life to the worship of Lord Krishna. So now this establishes the point that we have been trying to understand all along. So the Bhakti movement necessitated that devotion to God can be offered at a personal level without the aid of priests and rituals, and Mirabai and her devotion to Lord Krishna is a classic example in this regard. Now, before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Will you be able to help me fill in the blank with the correct answer? Mirabai is known for her devotion to Lord Krishna, Lord Shiva, Lord Brahma, or Lord Vishnu. Well, the correct answer is Lord Krishna. Mirabai is known for her songs of devotion to Lord Krishna. What we have been discussing all this while about the evolution of religions pertains to Hinduism alone. But do you think Hinduism is the only religion that existed in medieval India? Most definitely not, because India has been characterized by religious plurality since ages. Now, in this regard, let us talk about something different. Trade relations between Arabia and the Indian subcontinent existed since long back. And these trade relations were further enhanced and strengthened in and around the 7th century. Because around this time, many traders and merchants were coming from West Asia to trade with the Indian subcontinent. And along with these traders and merchants, many invaders from West Asia also made their entry into the Indian subcontinent. Now, many of these invaders, after conquering different regions, went on to establishing their own kingdoms. Now, a point that we should mention in this regard is that whenever any ruler or any king established their own dynasty or rule in ancient or medieval times, they made sure to spread their religion among the masses. Now, something similar also happened when traders, merchants, invaders from West Asia came to India. Now, the influence of the traders and the merchants were not restricted to trade activities alone. They brought with them new ideas, and we also learnt that these invaders established their kingdoms. So together, this contributed to the influx of new ideas. Now, what are those new ideas that we are referring to in this regard? In and around the 7th century, invaders, merchants, migrants from West Asia introduced the teachings of the Quran to the Indian subcontinent. And with this, the religion of Islam now entered the subcontinent. So previously we learnt about how Hinduism was existent in the Indian subcontinent, and along with Hinduism, now we see the foray or the entry of Islam into the subcontinent. Muslims are those people whose faith is Islam, and Muslims regard the Quran as their holy book. They accept the sovereignty of their one God, that is Allah. They believe that this benevolent God embraces all whoever offers devotion to Allah, irrespective of a person's social status, a person's social background. Allah, the bounty and the love of Allah embrace everyone. Just a while ago, we learnt about the invaders who came to the Indian subcontinent and established their own kingdoms and dynasties here. Now, many of these invaders who later became rulers were patrons of Islam. And along with that, they also extended patronage to the ulama. Now, who were the ulama? While we were talking about Hinduism, we took into account the Brahmanas, who were learned men. So the Brahmanas were knowledgeable learned men who imparted knowledge of the Sanskrit texts among the masses. Similarly, the ulama were scholars, learned theologians and jurists. Now, Islam is interpreted in a host of ways by its followers. While on the one hand, we have the Shia Muslims, on the other hand, we have the Sunni Muslims. So these are different sects of Islam, and these different sects interpret Islam in their own ways. Now, while we have the Shvetamvaras and the Digamvaras within Jainism, we have the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. Now, from this, a very important question that must be coming to your mind is that what caused this divide or split between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims? Now, the divide between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims arose from a dispute over who would be the legitimate leader of the Muslim community after Prophet Muhammad. Now, while on the one hand, the Shia Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law Ali is the legitimate leader of the Muslim community, the Sunni Muslims accept the authority of the early leaders or the Khalifas and the succeeding Khalifas. So can you understand how the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims constitute two different sects within Islam itself? Now, when there are different sects, as in the Shia Muslims or the Sunni Muslims, there will be differences in opinion on different grounds. Now, firstly, we learned about the dispute over who would be the legitimate leader, and this caused the divide between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. Now, these different sects also interpret Islamic law in different kinds of ways. And this gives birth to the different schools of Islamic law. Now, these schools of Islamic law are not the school that you go to. These are different kinds of interpreting the Islamic law. Among the various schools that interpret the Islamic Sharia law in different ways, the Hanafi and Shafi could be found in India. Now, differences also exist on the grounds of Islamic theology and mystic traditions. It goes without saying that when there are different sects within the same religion, these different sects or these different groups of people will interpret laws and various practices in their own ways. This now brings us to an end of our discussion on the evolution of religions as it could be found between 700 to 1750 CE. Now, here we talked about a very important point, that religions are rooted in the communities, religions are shaped by the communities, and in turn religions also shape the communities. Now, while the communities evolve into assuming new shapes, religions also evolve. Here we learned that during this process of evolution, be that in Hinduism or other religions, many new gods started being worshipped. Many aspects of these religions were modified, and after all these modifications and changes, these religions assumed the shape that we see and experience in today's world. So religion, like communities, are not static factors. Religions are dynamic in nature, and this has been the focal point of this discussion. In a subsequent lesson, we will be focusing on the different kinds of technological changes that entered the Indian subcontinent and how those technological changes impacted the socio-cultural political landscape of India over those 1,000 years. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.